Welcome to the legends of Britain. The cold bites. Grip tight. January 330 BC, the Zagros Mountains, southern Persia. You are marching through a gorge so narrow that the men beside you are close enough to touch. The walls rise on both sides, sheer, music, rock climbing so steeply into the winter sky that the sun barely reaches the floor of the pass for more than an hour each day. The cold is a physical thing, not the cold of a winter morning that fades when the sun rises. Mountain cold, the kind that works its way through armor and wool and finds the music spaces between your bones. You are Macedonian. You have not lost a battle, music, in 4 years. You crossed the Hellespont. You won at the Granicus. You trapped Darius at Issus and watched the most powerful king on earth abandon his own family to escape you. You built a road across the sea and took a city that had stood unconquered since the beginning of recorded history. Music, you destroyed Darius's final army at Gaugamela on a plain he chose, music, specifically to destroy you. Clear's throat, Babylon opened its gates. Susa surrendered without a fight. The treasury of an empire, 120,000 talents of gold and silver, is now behind you in Macedonian hands. You are 3 months from the greatest victory in the history of the ancient world. And right now, you are running. Not retreating in good order, not withdrawing, music, to regroup, running. Back through the gorge you entered an hour ago, past the bodies of men you trained with and fought beside for years, bodies you are leaving behind because there is no time to carry them and no room to turn and face, music, what is still firing from the cliffs above. The man in front of you is Alexander. And he is retreating. For the first time in the entire Asian campaign, the man who has never once turned his back on an enemy, music, is turning his back. On the heights above you, a Persian commander named Ariobarzanes, a man whose name almost nobody in your army knew before this morning, a man, music, who did not run at Gaugamela with Darius, a man who gathered his forces, chose a pass in the Zagros Mountains that he knew better than any Macedonian ever, music, could, and waited patiently, quietly, until the army that had destroyed everything in its path walked into music, the one place where destroying everything in its path was no longer possible. The Persian Gate is closed. The road to Persepolis, music, the golden heart of the Persian Empire, the ceremonial capital of everything Alexander has spent 4 years fighting toward, is blocked by a man the history books barely remember. With terrain so effective that numbers and training and the finest cavalry in the ancient world are completely irrelevant. By nightfall, Alexander will know that he cannot force this pass. By the following morning, he will know that waiting is not an option either. What he does next, in the middle of a freezing mountain night with no roads, no maps, and a captured shepherd as his only guide, will determine whether the conquest of Persia succeeds or dies in these mountains. And here is what makes Persian Gate different from every other battle in Alexander's campaign. He does not have a plan yet. By the end of this, you will know exactly what he found in those mountains, what it cost him to find it, and why the battle that history almost forgot came closer to ending everything than Gaugamela, Issus, and the walls of Tyre combined. If this is the kind of history that stops your scroll, music, subscribe because this story is just getting started. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about the world Alexander had been moving through for the 3 months before this pass. Everything had been surrendering. Music, not fighting. Not negotiating from strength. Surrendering. Opening gates, sending out officials with account books and treasury keys, and formal declarations of submission, music, before a single Macedonian soldier appeared at the walls. City after city. Province after province. The greatest empire the ancient world had ever built, an empire stretching from Egypt, music, to the borders of India. An empire that had existed for 200 years and had absorbed everything before it was folding like wet parchment in front of one Macedonian army that had not lost a battle in 4 years. This matters because it tells you exactly what state of mind 17,000 men were in when they entered the Persian Gate in January 330 BC. They were not alert. They were not cautious. They were not the sharp-eyed careful soldiers who had crossed the Hellespont 4 years earlier wondering whether they were going to survive what was coming. They were men who had stopped asking whether anything was coming. Now, meet the man who understood that. His name was Ariobarzanes, music, satrap of Persis, the governor of the Persian heartland, the province that contained Persepolis itself, the man appointed by Darius III specifically to protect the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. He had been at Gaugamela. He had stood on that battlefield in October 331 BC and commanded a regiment of soldiers from the Persian, music, Gulf provinces while the largest force his empire had ever assembled, music, was destroyed in a single afternoon. He had watched Darius flee. He had watched the army dissolve around a king who chose survival over authority. He did not flee. History does not record exactly, music, what Ariobarzanes did in the immediate aftermath of Gaugamela. What it records is what he did next. He did, music, not surrender his province the way every other satrap between Babylon and Persepolis had surrendered, music, theirs. He did not send envoys with account books and keys. He did not wait on the road with flowers and garlands like the governor of Babylon. He went home to Persis, to the mountains he had governed since 335 BC. Mountains he knew the way a man knows his own house. Every pass, every ridge, every place where the road narrowed and the walls, music, rose and the ground itself became a weapon. And he started preparing. Here is what Ariobarzanes knew that Alexander did not. The Persian Gate was not simply a pass through the Zagros Mountains. It was the pass, the only viable direct route between Susa, music, and Persepolis for an army moving with siege equipment and supply wagons. The royal road, the longer, music, route that wound around the mountains, was the safe option. The Persian Gate was the fast option. And an army that had been moving fast for 4 years without consequence was almost certainly going to choose fast. The pass itself was a natural killing ground unlike anything in the ancient world of siege warfare. The approach opened across a wide flat plain, music, deceptively calm, offering no warning of what the road ahead was about to, music, become. Then, the valley walls closed in. The gorge narrowed sharply. At its tightest point, the road reduced to a few meters wide, barely enough for soldiers to advance more than 4 abreast. High ridges dominated both sides, rising steeply enough that men positioned on the heights could fire directly down into the column below at angles that made shields almost irrelevant. The road curved southeast at the critical point, music, which meant the morning sun, rising exactly where an advancing army would be looking, obscured visibility toward the slopes above. Ariobarzanes chose a position near what is today the village of Cheshme-i Chena, built a barricade of earth and stone across the road at the point where the gorge was tightest, positioned his archers and soldiers on the heights on both sides, placed boulder teams on the ridgelines above the most congested, music, section of the approach. Then, he waited. For weeks he waited quietly while the Macedonian army moved from Babylon toward Susa and from Susa toward the mountains, while the scouting parties that preceded the column rode out and came back reporting nothing of concern, while the commanders who had stopped asking hard questions moved their men forward with the confidence of soldiers who had been seriously challenged in months. Ariobarzanes waited with the patience of a man who understood something fundamental about momentum. The faster something is moving, the harder it is to stop. Music, and the harder it is to stop, the more completely it destroys itself when it finally hits something immovable. He was going to be immovable. The column entered the pass at full march, music, on a January morning in 330 BC. The plain at the approach was exactly as the scouts had described. Wide, open. No sign of organized defense. The soldiers at the front moved forward with the casual alertness of men who had been moving forward for 4 years without consequence. The rear units pressed up behind the front without knowing what the front was walking into. The column stretched back across the valley floor. Thousands of men compressed by the narrowing gorge into exactly the formation that Ariobarzanes had spent weeks preparing to receive. When the vanguard reached the bend in the pass, they found the barricade. Earth and stone packed across the road from wall to wall. In that moment, music, before anything else happened, before the boulders rolled and the arrows fell and the screaming started, there was 1 second of complete silence where every man at the front of that column understood, music, simultaneously what the barricade meant. They had been expected. Then the heights came alive all at once. Not one section at a time. Not a gradual escalation that gave the men at the front a moment to process what was happening and pass word back through the column. All at once, from the northern ridge line, boulders, not thrown, rolled. Massive stones that had been positioned over days and weeks at precisely the angles required to send them tumbling down the slope at maximum speed directly into, music, the densest section of the pass below. From the southern slope, arrows. Thousands of them fired from elevated positions at angles so steep, music, that the shields the Macedonian soldiers raised instinctively were almost useless. A shield held in front of a man stops an arrow coming at him horizontally. Music, it does almost nothing against an arrow dropping nearly vertically from 40 m above. The front of the column had nowhere to go. The barricade of earth and stone across the road blocked any forward movement. The gorge walls rose on both sides too steep to climb under fire, and from behind the rear units of the column who had heard nothing yet, music, and seen nothing yet were still pressing forward, still marching, still carrying the momentum of an army that had been moving forward for months without stopping. The men at the front were being compressed between the barricade ahead of them and the weight of thousands of men pushing from behind who did not yet know they needed, music, to stop. The ancient historian Curtius described what happened in language that has not, music, lost its force in 2000 years. Some were crushed by the great boulders rolling from the mountains. Others were transfixed by arrows. Still others, wounded and frantically trying to retreat, were trampled by their own comrades pressing forward from the rear. Platoons, music, disappeared in minutes. Think about what that means from inside the column. You are a Macedonian soldier somewhere in the middle of this formation. You cannot, music, see the front. You cannot see the barricade. You cannot see the heights or the men on them or the boulders that are already rolling. All you can hear is the sound changing. The normal noise of an army on the march, boots on stone, the creak of equipment, the low conversation of men who have been walking together long enough that they barely register each other's voices anymore. Giving way to something else. Something coming from the front, music, that takes a moment to identify because you have not heard it in a long time. Screaming. And then the men in front of you stop, music, moving. And the men behind you keep pushing. And then the men in front of you stop, music, moving. And the men behind you keep pushing. And the gorge walls are right there on both sides. Close enough to touch if you reach out. And the screaming from the front is getting louder and still you cannot see what is, music, causing it. Then the arrow finds the man beside you. Alexander was near the front when the ambush sprung. Every ancient source that covers the Persian Gate agrees on this. He was not commanding from the rear. He was where he always was. At the point of whatever was happening. And what was happening now was a massacre in a space too narrow to fight back in. Music, the sarissa, the 6M pike that was the Macedonian phalanx's primary weapon, music, was completely useless in a gorge a few meters wide under vertical missile fire. You cannot form a phalanx in a corridor. You cannot deploy cavalry on a road barely wide enough for 4 men. Every tactical advantage the Macedonian army possessed evaporated the moment it entered that pass. Numbers meant nothing. Training meant nothing. 4 years of victories meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the terrain. And the terrain belonged entirely to Ariobarzanes. Alexander gave the order to retreat. Music, the retreat itself became part of the disaster. The rear units pressing forward met the front units pushing back in a collision of panicked men, music, in a space too narrow for either group to get out of the other's way. The wounded who could not move fast enough were trampled. The dead could not be carried. There was no room and no time and the missiles were still falling from above. Men who had fought at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, men who had survived everything the Persian Empire had thrown at the finest army in the ancient world, died in that gorge, not singing in battle but in a crowd, pressed against each other, unable to see their enemy, unable to raise their weapons, unable to do anything except try to move backward fast enough to survive the next boulder coming down the northern slope. Modern estimates put Macedonian casualties from the initial ambush at somewhere between 200 and 500 killed outright. Hundreds more wounded. In a force of perhaps 10,000 men, those numbers were survivable. What was not survivable, what cut deeper than any casualty figure, was what Alexander had to do before the retreat was complete. He left his dead behind. Understand what that meant in the world these men lived in. For a Greek, or Macedonian soldier, the recovery and proper burial of the fallen was not a courtesy. It was a moral obligation so fundamental that abandoning the dead was considered one of the deepest dishonors, a commander could inflict on his army. The dead deserved burial. Their families deserved to know they had been honored. Their souls, in the belief system of every man in that column, deserved the rights that allowed, them to pass properly into whatever came next. Alexander left them on the floor of the Persian Gate because there was no alternative, because recovering them under continued missile fire from heights that his army could not reach would have cost more lives than it saved, because the retreat, had to happen now and completely and without the additional weight and time that carrying the dead would require. He knew what it cost. Every man watching him make that decision knew what it cost. The army that emerged from the Persian Gate was not the same army that had entered it. Not because of the casualties, because of something harder to measure and harder to recover from than casualties. For the first time in 4 years, they had been inside something they could not, fight their way through. They had been made to feel what it is to be helpless, to be at the complete mercy of ground that belongs to someone else, to leave their dead behind and walk away. The Persian Gate was closed. Ariobarzanes held it, and somewhere on those heights, watching the Macedonian army retreat back across, the plain below him, a Persian satrap whose name most of his own empire had already forgotten allowed himself one moment of something that the history books, almost never record. He had stopped Alexander the Great for now. But Alexander was already thinking. And thinking for Alexander was always the most dangerous thing he did. Alexander camped outside the Persian Gate and looked at his options. He had 3. None of them were good. The first was to, force the pass again. March back into that gorge with the same men who had just come out of it and, attempt to break through the barricade and the heights by sheer weight of numbers. Alexander had tried this. Not just once on the initial entry, the ancient sources make clear that in the days following the retreat, he ordered several additional frontal assaults, on the Persian position. Each one was repulsed. Each one cost more men. Each one confirmed what the first assault had established. The terrain at the Persian Gate belonged to Ariobarzanes, as completely as if it had been built specifically for him. Which, in a sense, through his knowledge of it and his weeks of preparation, it had been. No amount of Macedonian, courage or discipline or tactical brilliance changed the mathematics of men in a gorge 3 wide trying to advance uphill against defenders firing from heights they could not reach. The pass would not be forced. The second option was the royal road, the long route around the mountains that Parmenion had taken with the baggage train and the allied forces. It was safe. It was functional. It was the kind of approach that a cautious commander would have used from the beginning. Alexander could abandon the direct route, march his force around to meet, Parmenion, and approach Persepolis from a direction that Ariobarzanes had not fortified and could not easily defend. But that route had problems, of its own that went beyond mere distance and time. Darius was still alive. He had fled east after Gaugamela, first toward Ecbatana in Media, then further. Every week Alexander spent on roads was a week Darius used to rebuild. Every month of winter marching was a month the Persian king had to assemble forces from the eastern, provinces, Bactria, Sogdia, India, territories so distant and so different from the Western Empire that Alexander had conquered that they remained entirely untouched and entirely capable of resisting. Music. If Darius reached those provinces with enough time and enough men, the conquest, music, of Persia would not end with Persepolis. It might not end at all. Speed mattered. Every day mattered. The third option was the one nobody had yet found. Music, another route. A path through the Zagros mountains that bypassed the Persian Gate entirely, coming out behind Ariobarzanes' position rather than trying to break through it from the front. The problem was that nobody in Alexander's army knew whether such a route existed. The mountains around the pass were winter mountains, music, cold, steep, rocky, largely unmapped by anyone who had reason to write the maps down. His engineers, music, could not tell him. His cavalry scouts had ridden as far as the terrain allowed and come back with nothing useful. The royal road was known. The Persian Gate was known. Music, everything else in those mountains was darkness. Then they found the shepherd. The ancient, music, sources do not agree on exactly who he was or precisely how he came to Alexander's attention. Arrian says it was prisoners of war who revealed the route. Music, Curtius describes a local shepherd. Some accounts combine both, prisoners who confirmed what a shepherd described. Music, what every source agrees on is the essential fact. Someone who knew those mountains, a man who had moved through, music, them with animals across seasons that no army and no administrator had reason to track, knew of a path, steep, narrow, difficult in winter, dangerous in the dark, but possible. Possible was enough. Picture the moment Alexander received this information. Music, he had been sitting with a problem for days that had no solution. His army had been stopped, genuinely stopped, not delayed, not slowed, but stopped for the first time in, music, for years. The men who had crossed the Hellespont with him, who had survived the Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela and the siege of Tyre, were camped outside a mountain pass. Watching their, music, dead lie unburied on the other side of a barricade they could not cross. The campaign's momentum, that invisible force that had carried Alexander from the Hellespont, music, to the edge of the Persian heartland without a single defeat, had stalled in a Zagros gorge because of one man and one piece of geography. And now a captured, music, prisoner or a mountain shepherd was describing a goat trail through the winter darkness that might allow Alexander to do what, music, Ephialtes had done to Leonidas at Thermopylae, come around the back. The historical irony was not lost, music, on Alexander. He had spent 4 years being compared to Achilles. He had gone, music, out of his way at the beginning of the campaign to visit Troy and make offerings at the tomb of Achilles because he understood that the comparison was useful. That being seen as the continuation of a Greek heroic tradition gave his campaign a meaning beyond simple conquest. Now, he was about, music, to reprise the role not of Leonidas, but of the man who had betrayed him. The man, music, who had shown the Persians the mountain path around Thermopylae. The difference was that Alexander had not been, music, betrayed. He had found his Ephialtes himself. He moved quickly. The planning that other commanders spend days on Alexander compressed into hours. Music, Craterus, one of his most reliable generals, the man who had commanded the Macedonian, music, left at Gaugamela, was left in camp with his own brigade and several thousand additional soldiers. Music, his orders were specific and required exact timing. Light fires at night to make the camp appear, music, fully occupied. Keep the normal routines of an army in position. And when he, music, heard trumpet signals from the mountains above, when Alexander's force announced its arrival at the Persian rear, advance immediately against the barricade at the pass front. Music, fix Ariobarzanes' attention forward at exactly the moment the attack, music, came from behind. Philotas was assigned a separate detachment to secure the ridgeline on one flank of the Persian position. A third axis of attack that would prevent Ariobarzanes from repositioning his forces, music, to face the threat from the rear. Alexander himself took the elite of his army, the Hypaspists, his shield-bearing guards, the most, music, agile heavy infantry in the Macedonian force. The Agrianians, light infantry javelin men who could move across difficult terrain faster than conventional soldiers, the companion cavalry. Specific brigades under Perdiccas and others whose names Arrian recorded carefully because what they, music, were about to attempt deserved to be remembered accurately. They left camp in darkness. The shepherd or the prisoner or both went with them. Music. What followed over the next several hours was the most physically demanding operation of the entire Persian campaign. The path was everything, music, the sources promised it would be and more. Steep inclines in winter darkness with no light except what the stars provided and what a small number of torches kept low and shielded to prevent their light from reaching the Persian heights could offer. The men were carrying, music, weapons and rations and, singing, equipment across terrain that would have challenged experienced mountain travelers in daylight without, music, any of those things. In places the path narrowed to single file. Men moving one at a time across, music, sections where the rock face dropped away on one side into darkness and the mountain wall pressed in on the other. They moved in silence. Alexander had given explicit orders. No noise that could carry to the Persian, music, position. No stumbling. No dropped equipment. No conversations above a whisper. An army that had announced itself, music, with trumpets and battle cries at every engagement of the past 4 years was now moving through a Zagros mountain night in complete silence, music, following a shepherd through terrain that none of them had ever seen. The cold was relentless. January in the Zagros. The kind of cold that does not simply make you uncomfortable. It slows your thinking, music, and your movement and makes every physical action cost twice what it should. Men who had been warm in camp 2 hours earlier were now working their way up cliff faces in freezing darkness with, music, fingers that had partially stopped responding. They kept moving. Somewhere below and to the south, Craterus sat in camp watching his fires and waiting for a trumpet signal that might or might not come. Somewhere on the heights above the Persian Gate, Ariobarzanes watched the Macedonian camp below and saw what looked like an army still in position and not moving. And on a mountain path in the winter darkness between them, Alexander kept, music, climbing. Dawn came cold and absolute over the Zagros mountains. Music, Alexander was already in position. The night march had taken hours longer than anyone had anticipated. The path the shepherd had described as difficult had proven to be barely a path at all in places. Sections of loose shale in winter darkness where men had to feel their way forward one careful step at a time, passing word back through the column in whispers about where the rock face dropped away or where the footing was solid enough, music, to move faster. But they had made it. Every man who had started that climb in the darkness was still there when the first gray light, music, began separating the mountain shapes from the sky above them. Alexander looked down at the Persian encampment below. Cooking fires still burning. The shapes of men moving through the pre-dawn routines of soldiers, music, who had spent a month watching a Macedonian army camped on the plain below them and had stopped, music, expecting anything to come from above. He gave the signal. 6 trumpet blasts cut through the mountain silence, not the music, careful quiet of the night march. 6 sharp, clear trumpet calls carrying across the Zagros in every direction simultaneously. Below, music, on the plain, Craterus heard them and ordered his forces immediately toward the barricade, music, at the pass front. On the ridgeline to the side, Philotas moved his detachment into position against the Persian flank, music, and Alexander descended. What followed in the Persian encampment happened fast and completely and without any possibility of the defenders organizing a coherent response. Music, the terrain that Ariobarzanes' greatest weapon for a month became his prison in the space, music, of minutes. The same gorge walls that had prevented Alexander's army from deploying now prevented the Persian defenders from escaping. The heights that had given the Persian archers their killing angles, music, were now occupied by Macedonian soldiers firing down into the position below. The barricade that had stopped the Macedonian advance cold was now blocking Persian movement in the opposite direction. Men trying to flee south through the pass found Craterus, music, advancing from that direction with several thousand soldiers who had been waiting for exactly, music, this signal. Three directions simultaneously. From above, from the flank, music, from the front. The narrow terrain that Ariobarzanes had chosen because it neutralized Macedonian now neutralized his own ability to respond, music, to attacks from multiple angles. There was no room to reposition, no space to concentrate forces against any single threat, no way to choose which, music, direction to face without leaving the others completely undefended. Arrian describes the final, music, fighting in language that makes clear it was close and brutal, music, even in defeat. Some Persians attempted to climb the gorge walls to escape, music, and fell. Others crowded into the narrowest parts of the pass, music, and stumbled over each other in the press of bodies. Some, music, the ones the ancient sources consistently describe with something close to admiration, did not attempt to escape at all. They drew what weapons they had and charged into the Macedonian lines, unarmed men grappling with armored, music, soldiers, men who had nothing left to fight with seizing Macedonian weapons from the men carrying them and using those, music, weapons against their original owners in the final moments of a battle they had already lost. Music, Ariobarzanes himself escaped. This is, music, the detail that the clean version of the story prefers to leave out, but that the ancient sources, all of them, across their disagreements about almost everything else, agree, music, on. He was not killed in the pass. He broke through somehow. With a small number, music, of survivors around him, he moved east toward Persepolis, the city he had spent a month trying to protect, the city whose treasury and palaces were the entire reason this battle had been fought. And Persepolis closed its gates against him. Tiridates, the Persian noble appointed by Darius III as guardian of the royal, music, treasury, the man responsible for the wealth of Persepolis had been in secret communication with Alexander during the music siege. He had made his calculation the same way every satrap between Gaugamela and the Persian Gate had made their calculation and reached the same conclusion. Resistance was futile. Cooperation with the new reality was the only survival strategy that made any sense. Music, the gates stayed closed. Ariobarzanes, the satrap of Persis, the man who had held Alexander the Great at bay for an entire month with a fraction of the forces, music, the ancient sources credited him with, the man who had come closer to stopping the conquest, music, of Persia than Darius himself had managed at either Issus or Gaugamela, died outside the walls of the city he had given everything to protect. The sources disagree on precisely how. Some say he was killed in a final desperate charge into Macedonian lines outside the city walls. Some say, music, he was captured and executed. Arrian suggests he escaped further north before meeting his end. What every source, music, agrees on is that he did not survive the week. His sister Utab, a Persian noblewoman who ancient, music, sources record had fought alongside him throughout the entire battle, died with him or near him. The precise, music, circumstances are lost. What remains is the fact that she was there, that a woman fought and died defending the Persian heartland in the winter of 330 BC, and that the Greeks, music, who recorded it thought it worth mentioning even in accounts that had no particular reason to honor Persian courage. Some, music, things are worth recording regardless. Alexander reached Persepolis on one of the last days of January, music, 330 BC. The city surrendered immediately. Tiridates handed over the keys. This channel exists to find the stories underneath the stories. Music, the battles that history buries under the more famous ones beside them. The commanders on the losing side who came close enough to winning that the word losing barely covers what they actually did. Ariobarzanes of Persis is one of those commanders, and now you know his name. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Music, the next video takes you to the Hydaspes River in India. Alexander has been marching east for 6 years. His army has followed him further from home than any Greek force in history. And now on the far bank of a monsoon-swollen river stands a king named Porus with war elephants, animals that the Macedonian horses are terrified of, and an army that chose to, music, fight rather than run. Alexander has never crossed a defended river crossing against war elephants in monsoon season. He is about to figure out how. That story is next. 87,286.